In our last lecture, we took a look at the early life of Martin Luther and basically bringing him up to the point where he was a university lecturer and a parish priest in the city of Wittenberg, Germany. Well, as we said before then, in the year 1514, Luther became a local church preacher and a pastor in Wittenberg. Don't forget that. He wasn't only a university teacher, but he was also a pastor. He combined both roles in his daily responsibilities. But it was more his heart as a pastor and as a Bible teacher than it was as a university professor that started the controversy which started the Reformation, and that was the whole controversy over the sale of indulgences. Now we sort of have to back up and give a little bit of background for this. In Roman Catholic thinking, there are two penalties for every sin. There's the spiritual penalty and there's the temporal penalty. The priest can absolve you or forgive you the spiritual penalty, but you have to deal with the temporal penalty yourself. I mean, we sort of understand this, right? Let's say a man or a woman is an alcoholic, right? And you can say, well, there's a spiritual penalty for that addiction, for that sin that they suffer under. Yes, it's true. There's a spiritual penalty for that. But there's also a earthly or a penalty that's held within time, right? They ruin their health, they ruin their family. So this idea between being a spiritual penalty and a temporal penalty, it's not hard to figure out how they would make that distinction. The simple idea is that every sin has its inescapable consequences. Well, we might limit those inescapable consequences to what happens on this earth, right? In Roman Catholic theology, the inescapable consequences of sin go much beyond that. And basically, what you have to do is, let me phrase that. What you have to do is not the right way to begin that sentence. Instead, let me say that part of the inescapable consequences of sin, part of the temporal consequences of sin, have to do with purgatory. Again, we need to sort of understand the Roman Catholic doctrine of purgatory. You see, Roman Catholics had a very neat and clean system of salvation, right? If you kept the sacraments, if you checked off the box of the sacramental system, then you knew that you were saved. However, as I discussed in a previous lecture, there was the great difficulty of seeing people who had checked off all the boxes but lived terrible lives. And how do you reconcile the two? How can you say, this person has done everything that the church says they must do in order to be saved, but they sure don't live anything that looks like a godly life? How do you reconcile that within your head? They reconciled it by basically creating the doctrine of purgatory, which says that person, and indeed most all people, can't go straight to heaven when they die. Instead, they go to a sort of a middle place called purgatory, where they are purged from their earthly sins. That's the whole foundation behind the idea of purgatory. It's purging. You're cleansed. And basically what happens in purgatory is you suffer under, in Roman Catholic theology, literally the fires of affliction. Purgatory is a hot place where people suffer, and that suffering pays the temporal penalty of their sin, and then once that is paid off in purgatory, you go to heaven. Now, if a person is good on this earth and follows the sacraments, they have a little bit of purgatory, right? If a person's bad, they have a lot of purgatory. But understand this, in Roman Catholic theology, purgatory is only for the saved, right? The damned go straight to hell. And purgatory has the idea of the place where you're cleaned up before you go to hell, before you go to heaven, and you're cleaned up depending on how dirty you are, and therefore it's for everybody. Now, there's a few people whom the Roman Catholic Church considers saints who don't go to purgatory at all, right? They're good enough to where they go straight to heaven. But that's very, very few people. Now, basically, what you did when you bought an indulgence was you were doing penance. if anybody was raised in a Roman Catholic environment, you know what doing penance is, right? You go into the confessional, you confess your sins to the priest, and the priest will say, okay, here's your penance. I want you to say 5 Our Fathers and 3 Hail Marys. And that would be a typical example of a penance, at least when I was a young boy in the Roman Catholic Church. That's what they might tell you. Who knows, today they might do other things. They might assign you to do good works. And so you'd go out after the confessional, and you'd go kneel near the altar. You'd go to the pew, and you'd say the required number of Our Fathers and the required number of Hail Marys, and that was the penalty that you paid for your sin. Basically, indulgence was buying penance. It was a way to demonstrate your repentance through the giving of money instead of through doing some good work. Now, it wasn't until the 11th century that indulgences were given to relax the temporal penalty of sin on the condition that the money be given for the building of a church or a monastery. Then the practice of indulgences became more and more widespread with the advent of the Crusades, beginning with the First Crusade in 1095. Pope Urban II then promised the remission of all penance to those who fought in the crusade to liberate the Holy Land, and later on, this was extended to those who simply supported the crusades with money, right? I mean, if a soldier gets time off purgatory for fighting in the crusade, why shouldn't somebody who supports the crusades with their money? In the year 1343, the sale of indulgences was endorsed by an official church decree. And that official church decree read this: "Now this treasure is not hidden in a napkin or buried in a field, but he entrusted it to be healthfully dispensed through blessed Peter, bearer of heaven's keys, and his successors as vicars on earth, to the faithful for fitting and reasonable causes, now for total, now for partial remission of the temporal punishment of sins. And to this heap of the treasure of the merits of the Blessed Mother of God and of all the elect, from the first just man to the last, are known to have supplied their increment." Now again, this sort of brings in another aspect of it. The idea is that Mary and all the saints from the beginning of time have made their deposits in what I described in a previous lecture as the bank of grace, right? They've deposited all their merits in the bank of grace. So there's all this treasury of good works and merit and grace upon which the church can draw. And the Pope, because in Roman Catholic thinking, he has the power to bind anything on earth and bind anything in heaven, or loose on earth and loose in heaven. The idea is that the Pope has the right to take from that treasury of merit and give it to whoever he wants to. Therefore, if the Pope wants to, he can erase all your time in purgatory, or some of your time in purgatory, or some of your aunt's time in purgatory. And the Pope says, if you do a good work, I will take some of your time off in purgatory, or some of your Aunt Elda's time off purgatory, or whatever. Now, you get the idea here. The idea is that the Pope is in charge of this treasury of merit, and he can dispense it as he wills. Well, this developed in not very long a time to the place where people would come and make a financial contribution, and there would be a guy who would write them out a letter of indulgence and say, you know, we've received your contribution, you get this much merit from the Pope, and it takes time off for you in purgatory or for your, relative, whoever you want to do it on behalf of. And this was quite a trade. And you can imagine that this made the church a lot of money. And when they especially needed money, they would push the sale of indulgences. That they would sort of have the indulgence super sale, or, blowout, or whatever it is, where they would go out and try to sell a lot of indulgences. Now, Pope Julius II in 1508 and 1513, they needed money to finance their wars in Italy. So they did what popes had done before them. They turned to indulgences as a way of raising money. Now, Albrecht of Brandenburg, a German prince, purchased various parishes and bishoprics in Germany in the early years of the 16th century. In the year 1513, he made an agreement with Pope Leo X to sell indulgences in his land. But by a secret arrangement, half the money went to pay off the debt that he had incurred in buying all those clerical offices, and the other half went to the Pope for the rebuilding of St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. So they were going to push the sale of indulgences in the German lands. Part of the money would go to the prince, part of the money would go to the Pope for the rebuilding of St. Peter's, so forth and so on. And because they really wanted to make a lot of money and sell a lot of indulgences, Albert chose a man named John, sometimes called Johann, we might say in a modern way Johann Tetzel, a Dominican monk, to sell the indulgences. And again, you have to just consider that they did this in a very salesman-like way. They would go from place to place and set up their displays and preach their sermons and make their slogans. Matter of fact, Tetzel had a slogan. So wie das Geld im Kasten klingt, die Seele aus dem Feuer springt. When the money in the basket rings, the soul from purgatory springs. That's the idea. And when the indulgent salesman would come to town, they would give it with taking. Basically, they would come to town. They would come to the parish priest, right? The guy who's the basic pastor, the priest over an individual church, and they'd say, "Hi, pastor, we'd like to take over your service this Sunday. You know, can we have your service because we want to offer your people something good." And so, you know, most of the time, or I guess a lot of the times, the pastors would agree, the priests would agree, and they would do this. And they would take it on, they would preach fiery sermons. Tetzel used to say things like, "Listen to the voices of your dear dead relatives and friends, begging you and saying, 'Pity us, pity us, we are in dire torment, from which you can redeem us for a pittance. Do you not wish so?'" Do you see how he would do this? They'd say, "Can't you hear your dear Aunt Eldna, screaming to you from purgatory? Oh, if you just weren't such a tightwad and you'd give the money for the indulgence, I could be freed from this place." You see, when the indulgent salesmen come to town, they'd set up inside the local church, and once they were there, regular preaching was suspended and forbidden. Actual drafts of indulgent sermons from this time exist, and that was the whole idea here. They would say, "Do you not hear the voices of your dead parents and of other people screaming and saying, 'Have pity on me, for the hand of God has touched me. We are suffering severe punishments and pains in purgatory, from which you could rescue us if only you would.'" And then they would say, "Open your ears, because the father is calling to the son and the mother is calling to the daughter." And you can imagine in these medieval days when a large part of the population was rather superstitious in their outlook, what an effect this would have. Now, how much would an indulgence cost? Well, it would depend on how much money you had. Kings and queens would be charged a high price, high counts and prelates a lesser price, low counts and prelates still lower, merchants and townspeople a step below, artisans one more step, and then the indigent were told, well, if you had no money whatsoever, they would just say, "Well, fast and pray and we'll give you an indulgence." But this is what you have to understand. Even though many people were attracted to the sale of indulgences through all this guilt, through all this superstition, at the same time, people didn't really like it. And there are many cases of the sellers of indulgences being strung up, being beaten, being driven out of town. Because even though they were popular among many people, there were other people who despised the sale of indulgences and who felt that it was a real crime to have such a religious marketplace and spiritual things going around. Well, anyway, this man, Johann Tetzel, worked the territory right next to where Luther was a professor and a parish priest. Luther objected to the work of Tetzel because he thought people were getting ripped off. And so Luther absolutely forbade his territory to receive these sellers of indulgences. Tetzel would have loved to come into Luther's territory. I mean, they'd go everywhere he could. He'd love to take over Luther's Sunday morning service and say, let's use it for selling of indulgences. Luther said, "No way, you're not coming into my territory." And he told all his people, "Don't you mess around with these guys who are selling indulgences." Well, but when you say that, what do people do, right? A lot of his people just went over into the next county or the next parish area, and they started dealing with this. And when Luther heard about that, he got mad, and so he did the customary thing for a university professor to do. He invited a scholarly debate on the subject of